Okay, thank you. It's good to be here again. Last time I talked about the history of gender, medicine, science, and I think art in Europe from the Middle Ages to the present day in 15 minutes. So I thought this time I'd focus on a small handful of documents from West Cornwall. I think that might be easier for all concerned. And these are not, absolutely not, by the way, notes for exactly what I'm going to say. They're vital medical records that nobody could conceivably memorize, and I'm not relying on them in any way whatsoever. Okay. So my latest novel follows two parallel narratives. It cuts back and forth between the story of Tom, who is a lighthouse engineer in Japan. Well, he starts off as a lighthouse engineer in West Cornwall and goes to Japan, and his new wife, Ali, who is one of the first generation of female doctors. So these are both people who were alienated in their working lives. Tom, because he's British in Japan at a stage where there were very few British people in Japan. And Ali, because she's a woman now turning to hospital medicine, which was unusual for that first generation. A lot of them went into private practice, focusing mostly on obstetrics and family medicine. And hospitals were only beginning to adapt to the presence of women. Ali compounds this alienation by developing an interest in mental health, which in the 1870s, 1880s wasn't always seen as a medical issue. Asylums had doctors, but they were there as much to treat the physical ailments of the patients as to attempt to engage in any way with the madness, with the mental illness. So I'd already read most of the secondary literature about madness in the 19th century. I'm probably not the only novelist who found herself in that bit of the library without quite knowing why, always a bit worrying. But for a novel, you don't really need the secondary material. What you need is first-hand accounts of what it was like. What did the asylum smell like? How did the light fall in the corridors? How did the soundscape change as you moved around the building? Most of that you make up. You have to make up, and lying is kind of part of the job. But I quite like to know when I'm lying. So I looked around for the records of 19th century asylums. I was living in West Cornwall at the time, which is convenient because that's where the novel's set. And I looked at the catalogue of the Cornwall County Record Office and found that they had the archive of the Bodmin Asylum, which looked very promising. They were weirdly sketchily catalogued. There weren't really details about places and authors and dates in the way that you'd expect. So I went along to the County Record Office and said, I'd like to look at these, please. And the librarian kind of frowned and went off to find the archivist, at which point I knew that life was about to get complicated. And the archivist came back and asked me exactly what I wanted to look at. And of course, I didn't really know. And top tip, don't ever tell people you're a novelist. I mean, probably if you're really famous, you can tell people you're a novelist. But if you're not, they assume that you're either delusional or lying. So I had to just kind of stand there and invent this project. And I said, oh, well, I'm an academic at Exeter, which was true. And I'm working on a project about gender and definitions of insanity, which I was. It was just a fictional project. And I showed her my university card, which gets you into some surprising places. And she said, well, the problem was actually that this archive had never been catalogued. And she told me an extraordinary story that they'd had a phone call from the St. Lawrence Hospital at the point where they were moving out of the 19th century asylum buildings, saying that they'd found an archive room and please would the archivist come and collect all of these papers. So she got in her van and packed up her boxes and drove down to Bodmin. And when she got there, found a basement room, very damp, water running down the walls, full to knee height of papers just thrown on the floor. And as she rummaged through them, she found that the top layer were fairly recent and had confidential information about patients who were very definitely still alive and probably still patients. And the bottom layer went back to the 1850s. And she was about to start sorting through all of this, and they said, the builders are here, come on, you just have to get this stuff out of here. So she'd scooped it all into boxes, shoved it in the van, driven it back to the County Record Office, and there it still was. So when I turned up saying, I need to look at admission records for women from the 1870s, she didn't actually have them. At this point, I feel we should pause and give thanks for the staff of the Cornwall County Record Office, which was desperately understaffed and desperately underfunded, because she told me that if I knew what I wanted, she would catalogue it ahead of me as I read it. So that was what happened. So I went back the next day and every day for several weeks. And as I read, I think inevitably, I started to go slightly mad myself. I remember many times when I left, I went and sat on the steps of Sainsbury's, which was the nearest building, just kind of breathing, normal grey Cornish air and watching people going and doing their shopping, and then I'd go back in again. I had some very weird dreams. It was a very strange experience. The strangeness was not that there was anything very traumatic or violent or abusive going on in that asylum. I mean, I'm sure there was some of all of those. But I didn't form or confirm the impression that 19th century asylums were necessarily places of violence and abuse. It was that it was so ordinary. There were arguments about why the washing up wasn't being done properly. They'd bought some new cricket bats and one of them went missing, so there was a major inquisition to the whereabouts of the missing cricket bat. Some of the patients were arguing with each other. The administrator was playing a constant kind of game of chess of moving patients who were triggering each other around and trying to get the best possible sorts of combinations. But of course, every time you do that, you trigger something new. And it just all seemed very, very mundane and familiar. I mean, I read 50 years of the asylum record. There was only one instance of violence by staff against patients. There were probably others that weren't mentioned. But it became very clear that most of the difficulties of running a 19th century insane asylum were actually pretty much the difficulties of running a large family. You know, it's just getting everybody fed and cleaned and washed and saving the foolish from their folly and the strong from the weak from the strong. It wasn't very complicated. And then I started reading the reception orders for new patients. These are, in some ways, very tragic documents because they're usually the only record of an individual. They're the only time you get somebody's name and date of birth. The reception orders were the papers that were produced on the admission of a patient, and this is the only time these stories are told because there was very little talking therapy going on. I'm just going to read you some of them. This is my excuse for the paper. They fall into two categories: facts indicating insanity observed by myself being John Houck, member of the Royal College of Surgeons, England. And the other one was other facts, if any, indicating insanity communicated to me by others. And as I waded through these papers, I just had abbreviations for those phrases. I didn't need to write the whole thing out anymore. So people were being admitted because the doctor, who would have had no training in mental health whatsoever, could see these signs of insanity, and ideally they were substantiated by some kind of anecdotes from their friends or family, but sometimes they weren't. A desponding and melancholy state of mind, incoherence in talk, frequently remaining silent for considerable periods, refusing to speak when spoken to, then suddenly becoming very rapid and voluble in talk, accusing herself of moral and religious crimes, saying she is tired of life, is willing to be hanged, if she could be assured her children were in heaven before her. Somebody else. I had a moment's doubt about whether it was okay to read out their names, you know, whether is this all right that this is the only time these women have any public existence, but I think it probably is. I mean, it's certainly legal. Her mother-in-law says Lucy Gray's affections toward her own husband have been subverted into intense hatred. She has tried to injure one of the young children in the house. Her mental depression is very marked and her habits are altogether changed. This is one of the ones that stuck with me. Unsettled in mind, discontented with her residence, and hankers after victuals, decorations, and gaslights out of proportion to her station. Does not sleep well, is always talking about these things that she saw at Plymouth. Plymouth was the great metropolis, right? That case really stayed with me, and I can't actually now remember if this is true or this is something I made up. That was the basis in fact. But she was a girl who'd grown up in Plymouth and had then married a farmer right out on the tip of West Cornwall in West Penwith, and couldn't stop talking obsessively about the gaslights in the shop windows of Plymouth. You know, madness or homesickness? An order for the reception of a pauper patient, Mary Ann Vincent, aged 56, middle class of no occupation, of 5 Minnie Place, Falmouth. We were living in Falmouth at the time, and I went and had a look at 5 Minnie Place after reading this. She appears to be in great distress. When asked what troubled her, she replied, "They have taken away all the things." When asked what things, she replied, "All the tables and chairs and boxes. They are gone away in trains and carriages. I sent them away in a steamer." Someone else observes, "She frequently dances about and exclaims that the ships are all sinking. All our things are gone. We have lost our money." That really changed the way I saw Falmouth, which is where I was living at the time, because of course I knew it was a seafaring place and I knew things were coming and going by ship all the time. In the 19th century, as for us, you know, we could see the cargo ships coming by standing on the loo and leaning out of the bathroom window. Had a good sea view, according to the estate agent. But the idea that, particularly for women who often would have had no means of adjusting their own social status after losing things, a shipwreck really could wreck your mental health. It wasn't just losing stuff. That stuff was the substance of your bourgeois identity, and if it was gone, it was gone, and so was your place in the world. So I started noticing themes. Another thing that kept coming up was working class women going around their villages behaving like upper class women. There were at least 2 who'd been admitted because they went round the cottages of their neighbours, requesting to see cupboards and wanting to look at your account book and check that you were doing things properly. Well, if you think about Jane Austen, think about that scene in Emma where she goes to visit the poor and goes into all their cottages to make sure that they're eating properly and looking after their kids the way they should be and sweeping their floors. This is behaviour that would have been completely normal and acceptable if you'd had a different social status. And it went both ways. Very occasionally, it was middle and upper class women who were seen as insane because they were wandering around in rags and not eating properly. So there's something here that we no longer have, I think, about social status and madness, that to perform the wrong kind of class status might be a sign of madness. There was postnatal depression, there was alcoholism, there was addiction, a few young girls making public accusations of what we'd now call sexual abuse. Quite a number of cases of religious melancholy, which at first I just viewed as a historical exoticism and anachronism. Religious melancholy is when you become so profoundly convinced that you're going to be damned forever that you can't think about anything else. And the idea of burning to death for eternity fills your mind. When I'd read a few of these cases, I can see exactly how that works. I mean, of course, if that's what you believed, you would go mad. How could you not? Religious melancholy was noted to prevail in areas where people didn't drink. So for some time, there was an idea that if you gave the people suffering from religious melancholy enough alcohol, they might cheer up. I think I have the answer to this one, actually, which is that most nonconformist bits of Christianity encourage you both not to drink and to think about damnation. So I suspect it may be Cornish Methodism that's the problem rather than Cornish teetotalism. But, always worth a try. There was more. There were pages and pages more, years and years of people's lives. But what struck me all the way through was the absolute ordinariness of it. These women were ending up in asylums because of the things that happen, because of birth and death and sex and power, work and the class system, particularly bereavement. There were a lot of women there who'd lost children, and of course a lot of women did lose children in those days. The care was ordinary, well-meaning people doing their best in an overcrowded and underfunded system, may not be entirely unfamiliar to us. So where I'd begun expecting to find mad women in the attic and tales of terrible horror and abusive staff, actually what I found was a very recognizable, very familiar scenario for both the patients and the staff. Sad, damaged people doing their best for other sad, damaged people. Making the odd mistake, of course, and when you make mistakes in hospitals, they often have fatal consequences. But nobody was deliberately harming anybody else. I want to leave you with a fact from my secondary reading, to go back to the academic research. The rate of full recovery from mental illness for anyone who'd been an inpatient in the 19th century was about 40%. That's what it is today. Thank you.